Good evening, sir.
Good evening, Professor.
Good morning, good evening.
Oh, sorry, good morning there.
Yes, it's good
Across
morning
the
here.
world, good morning.
Yes, it's good evening in India, good morning in the United States.
All right, so we are at dot 6. Sorry for the multiple reminders.
No, that's good. You don't trust my mind. That's okay.
Should we start, Dr. Thakkar? Professor Garoupa, Dr. Thakkar is in Taiwan.
Oh, so
He's
that's
attending the Asian conference
Law
on
and
law.
Economics.
And I think your paper is being presented there, if I'm not wrong.
Yes, I think some of my co-authors are in Taiwan for the conference. And it must be dinner time right now in Taiwan, I guess. So,
Yes.
yes, sorry about that. I guess your dinner is not being, very productive food-wise. I hope it's more productive mind-wise. Okay, so Renita, should we start?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Please.
Okay, so so this is our second session on law and economics of crime and criminal law. I want to sort of summarize where we are, and then I do want to go over a few issues that are very relevant, and then of course open for questions. So last time we sort of summarized what we call the Beckerian model, which is sort of the Becker's model of 1968, and then how economists have addressed some of the concerns that the model raised. Of course, the first assumption, as we had a discussion at the end, I think Renita actually raised this, is the assumption that we have scarce resources, so we have to make choices in terms of where we want to put the costs. And if you think about the generalities of the Becker model, it is not very different from we have a negative externality that we call crime, and we need to internalize this externality. And obviously, for high transaction costs, this cannot be done through a Gaussian sort of argument. We don't expect criminals and their victims to negotiate a solution to their problem because of high transaction costs. So in the end, we have to go back to some sort of Pigouvian taxation. And so you can imagine the sanctions are just a form of Pigouvian taxation. Of course, the issue here, and that's what Becker reminds us, is that in this setup, these sanctions are probabilistic, right? Criminals do not bear the sanctions with probability 1. They bear with some probability. And that's where the discussion started last week is, well, if we have sanctions, and meaning the severity of sanctions, and we have probability of sanctions, what should be the optimal policy? And in the Becker's model, in the original model, the optimal policy is to have very high sanctions and very low probabilities. And the argument is because sanctions, particular fines, are cheaper, whereas probabilities are expensive because you have to have a criminal justice system. You need to have police, you need to have judges, and you need to have an infrastructure. And so his reasoning was we should basically pursue a policy of very high sanctions with very low probability. Now, the critique to that model is, as I said, and I listed a few reasons last week, is, well, that essentially does not take into account some of the issues posed by very high sanctions. One I mentioned was the marginal deterrence problem. That is, people commit many different types of offenses. If you have high sanctions for all offenses, at some point people don't have resources to pay for those offenses, and so it becomes sort of undeterred because they cannot get punished at some point. And so there's a marginal deterrence argument. The other argument was corruption and avoidance activities. If your sanction is too high and your enforcers are not paid very well, then of course you're inducing corruption and you're inducing offenders to engage in activities to avoid those high sanctions. So that makes enforcement more expensive. So that's a second line of argument. The third line of argument had to do with false positives and false negatives, type 1 error, type 2 error. If the system is not very good, very effective, you may have a problem of too many false positives, that is convictions of innocent. And then we got into the Blackstonian sort of reasoning. We don't want that. We prefer to have false negatives. That is, we prefer acquittals of guilty than convictions of innocent. And so you may need some sort of, management of sanctions to reflect that. And there are more arguments. I mean, the last argument I argued is if the judges and the general public opinion are not persuaded by these policies, they may actually don't like this. And so very high sanctions might have a legitimacy problem. They might even have an enforcement problem if the judges don't really pursue these policies or don't like these policies. So that gets into sentencing guidelines, codification of sanctions, and other issues. So as I said, there's plenty of work. I mean, many people have worked on this. So there's a long list of arguments against maximal sanctions. I don't think any economist would really, in a public policy discussion, argue that we should have very high sanctions for all sorts of crimes. In the end, I think what makes sense from an efficiency point of view is you have a menu of sanctions where the sanctions should reflect the harm, the level of the externality, and the probabilities should be adjusted accordingly. For those of you who have studied other areas of law and economics, you know there's something called the multiplier principle, which should also somehow be reflected here. The multiplier principle tells you that the fine or the sanction should be the harm divided by the probability. And that's why it's called a multiplier, because since the probability is a number less than 1, when you divide the harm by the probability, you're actually inflating the sanction. Now, this is important, and we have to realize why the multiplier principle exists. The multiplier principle exists because lawyers generally, when they are discussing specific cases, litigating specific cases, they tend to forget that it is not inevitable that people get convicted. That is, if you only convict with 20% probability, that means 8 out of 10 criminals get away. And if in your system 8 out of 10 criminals get away, that means 80% of the externality is not internalized. And that's a serious problem for efficiency. So you need to sort of inflate sanctions to take into account the probability. All right. So when people say, "Oh, I have a damage of $100, and therefore my fine should be $100," that is economically incorrect unless the probability is 1. But since the probability is less than 1, this creates a problem because your expected value is less than 100, which therefore in expected value, you're not bearing the cost of the externality. You are what we call underdeterred. So if we want to have appropriate deterrence, we need to be careful about the probabilities. I think, Renita, I think we need to mute someone. Someone is unmuted, so I can't see.
Participants, can you please mute yourselves?
I think everyone is muted now. Let me check. Yes. Okay, thank you. And so the issue here is to be careful about this. Now, the critique to Becker, in a way, is that he took the multiplier principle, which was well taken in law and economics. Those of you who have done torts or even contracts know that the multiplier principle is important in contract law, it's important in tort law. But Becker, in a way, took it to the next level by saying, okay, we need to inflate sanctions, but in a way, we need to inflate them to sort of, infinite at a very high level. And that's the point we're criticizing. So do not get the critique to Becker as a critique to the multiplier principle. We accept the multiplier principle. You need to control for the probability, because otherwise in expected value, you do not internalize externality. What we are saying is that taking the probability to zero and the sanction to infinite, as basically Becker was suggesting in a very simplistic way, it's problematic for all the reasons I mentioned. Okay, having said that, I think we need now to open other issues that we haven't mentioned. So the first I want to go over is the behavioral sort of law and economics critique. Now, one of the paradoxes of law and economics is that the Becker model, the criminal law and economics, is one of the most criticized and less accepted area of law and economics with lawyers and non-economists, generally speaking. The reason, of course, being that people argue that criminals are not rational people, and therefore the rational choice model is just simply wrong to apply to the setting of law of criminal law, because that's not how people behave. However, quite interestingly, well before the empirical legal studies movement took over in the last 10 years, the area that had more empirical work was exactly criminal law and economics, because most countries have data on crime. And so, well, from the 1970s, the criminal law and economics is one of the few areas that was actually embedded in empirical studies, which largely showed that there is some sort of deterrence effect. I'll come to that in a moment, because the things are a little bit more complex than that. But somehow that was the paradox. Empirically, we were finding that the economic model had some ability to explain reality, but at the same time, this was the least convincing economic model, because people were very upset about the idea that criminals make some sort of cost-benefit analysis. Now, when the behavioral law and economics movement started, immediately this was an area where there was a lot of discussion. And I think we need to sort of separate two issues here. One issue is the overall issue. Are criminals really rational or not? And the second is the extent to which some of these behavioral insights apply to criminal law. As to the first question, this is really a sort of a difficult and at the same time a tautological question, because of course people do not do cost-benefit analysis in criminal decisions in as much as they don't do in many other areas, like say family law and tort law. Why would people be rational there? And this leads to another issue, which is, are criminals different from people who obey the law, who comply with the law? I mean, is there something intrinsically different to these people? Because if you remember, the presumption by Becker is that there's nothing intrinsically different. Everyone does cost-benefit analysis. The only difference between a criminal and someone who complies with the law is that for a given action, for a given externality, the benefits outweigh the costs. Whereas for most of us, the costs outweigh the benefits. So we are deterred. So there's nothing intrinsic to a criminal except that the distribution of benefits is such that these people are at the tail of the distribution, whereas we are at the medium of the distribution, and that's why we are deterred. Now, this is important because as some of you may have studied criminology and introduction to criminology, introduction to criminal law, for a long time there was an effort to explain that criminals were different from everybody else. So as you know, in the 19th century, there's all this research about criminals being people with smaller brains, or taller people, or smaller people, or all these different issues that in the end could not really explain, because after all, you cannot really find anything specific that makes these people different. There is a phenomena, I don't know, I guess it's the same in India, but it's been a phenomena in Europe and United States that's still not really well explained, which is male are way more criminals than female. There's a gender issue here, that most criminals are male and not female. And there's been different explanations, and none of them is very convincing, except that after 150 years, this is still true. Although female rates have increased slightly and male rates have decreased slightly, but there's still significant difference in the US and in Europe, and I guess I'm guessing in India too. For a long time, of course, the explanation was sort of a sexist, male explanation that male are more violent, male want to protect their honor, male are sort of the dominating gender, female are weaker, female are the dominated gender, and so female don't commit crimes because they're too weak to commit crimes. So this is the 19th century sort of explanations that women only poison, and usually only poison their husbands, and so that's the only thing women do. They're not in the position to do any other sort of crime. Now we know that's really not true anymore. So in the 20th century, there was some sort of a feminist explanation. The feminist explanation was that the problem is that women are not in the labor market, and they have fewer social interactions than male because of sort of the patriarchal society we have. And so when female work as many hours as male, and when they have as many social interactions as male, and they live a long time outside of their home, female will commit as many crimes as male. And so, yes, we have male juvenile gangs, but we will have female juvenile gangs, and we have male being violent, but then women will also be violent. And so we sort of, as women get their own rights, we will see these trends sort of converging. Well, we have seen these women getting these rights. We have seen the women getting out of home. I don't know how many of you have already watched Barbie, but in Barbie land, women are in power, and as you have seen this, the trends have not really changed. So it's not true that as women get jobs, and as women get to work outside of home, and as women become more independent, and many women don't get married, and so they have their own social life distinct from their husbands, we have not seen these numbers becoming the same. So the feminist explanation, really based on women's rights and women's participation, does not seem to fit the data. And part of the current explanations, as I'm saying, some of them have to do with juvenile crime. The idea that most criminals are repeat offenders, are people who actually start quite early and then sort of get involved in this criminal career. And that men are more likely than female to do that because we also have more male dropping out high school and failing education than female. And that could be the explanation. So it would be a difference between male and female, age 15 to age 18. And that difference in terms of social participation, school, all of that would be that. Another possibility is that simply we have bad statistics. That is, we're not reporting is influencing statistics. And so many crimes don't go reported. And some of these crimes are committed by women or disproportionately by women. Hang on, I see some questions on the chat, so let's go with this. So yes, I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. Yes, there could be some bias in the way law enforcement agencies treat and report crimes, and that's why the statistics would not influence. Another possibility goes into, for example, someone is mentioning white-collar crimes. It could still be there, for example, that there's some feminist explanation. Okay, women do participate in labor markets now, they work, but the fact in some areas like white-collar crimes, women are still underrepresented in the top tier of corporations and financial firms. So it could be that simply women still don't have the opportunity to commit those crimes as much as men have. So that could be another explanation for white-collar crime, for example. And that's why we still don't observe that. The other explanation, of course, could be that people just commit different types of crimes. And in that regard, for example, sexual crimes are overwhelmingly committed by men, and this might actually have some biological explanation. And so it could be that in certain areas, the 19th century sort of explanation is still valid. When we focus, say, rape or any sort of, sexual violence, that men, because of their biology, their chemistry, is just more inclined than women to commit that sort of crimes. So I think there's different explanations. We just don't have a very good theory yet for that. Let me add, in the context of the United States, of course, the other discussion has been race, as you all know, and the extent to which, why is that we have so many Afro-American men, particularly in jail? Is that because Afro-American men are more inclined to be criminals than white male, or in fact that any other, female, white or non-white female? And of course, the problem here is, again, how you look at the data. And I think there are different explanations. One is that this is a reflection of economics. That is, obviously, Afro-American male are also more unemployed than other races. Of course, there could be law enforcement bias. It's a very serious possibility. But there's also two big issues in the United States which are problematic. One is the fact that Afro-American men in particular disproportionately give up school. And so a lot of these young men join gangs when they're 15 or 16 because they disproportionately give up school compared to white and Asian men. So that could be an explanation, which has to do with education, schooling, family dysfunctionalities, and other social problems that obviously public policy should look at. The other one, which is somehow related to this, is consumption of drugs. Again, consumption of drugs, in particular, the big crisis in the late 1980s, early 1990s, disproportionately impacted the Black community. Again, there's a lot of discussion in the US. Why is that Black men are more likely to consume drugs than any other race? again, could have to do with poverty, could have to do with unemployment, could have to do with dysfunctionality of family values. I mean, there's many explanations. I mean, could have to do with some sort of racism, obviously. But these two factors, the juvenile delinquency rates and the consumption of drugs that lead you to commit crimes, because remember, many of these actions are criminalized in the United States, that actually creates a significant issue to explain the race disparities. I mean, I didn't mention, because the other one is, of course, not Black, but Hispanics, in particular in California. And if you look at Hispanic imprisonment in California, about 80% of the men in prison in California, Hispanics, are drug-related offenses. So there's a clear correlation with drug consumption, drug trade, drug exchange. So it's a very problematic situations. Yeah, I mean, the issue of biological differences is a question by Kanak. Yes, I mean, there's some biological differences, but the problem there is exactly what you're trying to explain. That might be true for violent crimes or emotional crimes. That's not going to be very convincing for white collar crime and other types of crimes. And so the problem is when you're dealing with aggregated crime rates versus when you're trying to explain some specific crime rates. Because it does seem to be that these differences are also persistent for non-violent crimes. And so we would have to find some other explanation. One issue that I think somewhat Sarah was mentioning is also we need to be careful with some of these discussions, because remember, we are basing these observations on reported statistics, right? And that gets into a different discussion, right? Of course, as economists, you could argue, well, reporting is easy to explain. It's again cost-benefit analysis. The victims will report their crimes when the benefit for the victim outweighs the cost. Well, that's sort of problematic, because that actually presupposes a few things. First and foremost, that victims understand their victimization, which is not true in every crime. Of course, if you're talking about sexual violence, if you're talking about murder, if you're talking about violent crime, most of the time we understand our victimization, right? So that's an issue. But many other crimes, non-violent crimes, the victimizations might not be understood. I mean, most of us are victims of white-collar crime, victims of corruption, victims of bad regulatory punishment, and most of the time we don't understand, because it's widespread, the costs, the externality to each of us might not be very high, so we don't really have a clear idea if we've been victims of a crime. Obviously, when you're the direct victim of a violent crime, you know you have been the direct victim of a violent crime, and that question is not there. So that gets to the second problem, which is, even when you know you've been a victim of a crime, you may feel threatened psychologically and physically by the aggressor. So it's not clear you want to report your victimization, because you may be afraid of further aggressions, and therefore you may not even trust the law enforcement agencies. You may think that law enforcement agencies are not going to take seriously your complaint, and so that's going to be some sort of a problem. In fact, I don't know how this works in India, but take the case of the UK. It's not just a question of racism or sexism. There is a managerial problem. The police departments are budgeted as a function of success rates. Once you budget police departments as a function of success rates, this provides incentives to manipulate reporting rates. Because every time you have reporting crimes that you do not detect or you cannot find the criminal, that counts against success. So a lot of the mugging, a lot of the petty crime, you just tell the person, please don't report, or we're going to, not care about your reporting because this is against our budget. So there are many incentives. I don't mean just, being racist in the fact that I don't believe in other races being victims of crime. I don't mean sexism, like when women complain and male police officers just say, I don't believe you, that's not possible. I mean really managerial misincentives. And so a lot of these problems may lead us to statistical issues. In Europe, and a bit in the US, but more in Europe. Again, I don't know if this is something that the Ministry of Justice in India or the Ministry of Interior has done any studies. We now have what we call the victimization survey. And so we try to interview a panel of victims, of potential victims, every year to try to compare victim rates with police rates. And as you can imagine, the problem is if you look at the victim surveys, the rates of crime are twice or triple the official police rate. And so this has led to another, big empirical discussion. Is this because the police manipulates their rates? Is this because people don't report their victimization? Or is this that victims, in a way, overestimate their victimization, right? That is, many people, when they're doing the victim survey, say they have been victims of crimes that in fact have not taken place. It's just because they think they have been victims of crime for whatever reason, social pressure, compliance with social norms, engagement with the community, whatever. So there's a lot of discussions why there is this huge gap between the official police crime rate and the victimization survey, even for violent crimes. I mean here, even for violent crimes. So many of these studies have led to conclusions that, for example, sexual violence, the reporting rate might be lower than 10%, right? But the problem with many of these sexual violence crimes is that you don't know if the report rates were 100%, how many of these cases would lead to a conviction, right? Because one thing is for the victim to be convinced that the victim was a victim of sexual violence. Another is to prove this in a court of law beyond reasonable doubt. And so we have to be very careful with this data, in particular, if we're going to use this data to do empirical work. And that's why, largely speaking, and I'll come back to that when I talk a little bit about econometrics, most recent work in the last 10 years does not use aggregated criminal data, that it avoids to use the official crime rates, because we should be extremely careful about using official crime rates, even if we also have the victim survey rates and all that information, because it's very noisy, very problematic. Okay, so that's essentially one of the issues of trying to explain our crime rates and trying to argue that people are rational or not that rational. A second literature is, okay, if people are not fully rational, what sort of issues can we take from the behavioral law and economics literature and think they are relevant for this? Well, let me give you the two sort of issues. One is called the optimistic bias, right? This is sort of the idea that people tend to be more optimistic about the consequences than they should be from a rational point of view, right? Well, the problem with optimistic individuals is that the consequences for criminal behavior can go in different directions. The obvious one is, okay, people are more optimistic, so they commit more crimes than they should from a rational point of view, because they tend to be extremely optimistic that they won't get caught or that they won't get punished. And so in a way, they underestimate the expected value, and that's why the expected value of punishment, and that's why they are more criminal than they should be in a rational model. That's a possibility. But you can see also the other side of the argument saying, well, if people are optimistic, they might also be less careful, less willing to engage in avoidance activities, less willing to engage in corruption, because they're just optimistic that, this is not going to be a big issue. And so if that's the case, if they're optimistic to the point of being less careful, less engaging in avoidance activities, then this should make detection and punishment actually easier, because people are careless about committing their crimes. So as you can see, the argument could go easily both ways. It could be that, oh, this is going to be a problem because people are doing this more often than they should do it, and so enforcement is going to be more expensive. But it could be the other argument, oh, they're going to be doing this more, but in a less careful way, in a less rational way, so enforcement is going to be cheaper because people are not going to be extremely rigorous in their analysis of costs and benefits. So the optimist bias, for example, could go both ways, and it's very hard to see how we would incorporate this in our policy analysis if we're not completely sure how the optimism bias would affect behavior of crimes. Let me give you a second example, which is cognitive dissonance and framing effects. Right? As you know, that's also a documented behavioral bias, that people engage in cognitive dissonance. They do not understand reality as it is. They're very sensitive to framing effects. But again, how would this effect could go both ways? Because it could mean that, okay, you do not understand very well what's a crime and what's not a crime. You sort of filter your criminal actions as something like, I needed to do this. This is a good decision. Yes, I did something that's not really nice, but it's sort of needed. It's sort of okay. It's not morally wrong. And so you sort of go through a psychological filtering of your actions that, again, makes you more likely to commit crimes. So, okay, cognitive dissonance leads to more crime. But you could also have the opposite argument. Cognitive dissonance means you don't really understand the law very well. You really are not sure about what the law means. And so because you're not sure, you are actually more careful about what you do, because you're not completely sure if this action is a crime or not. You're not completely sure if this action is morally wrong or morally right, because you have some sort of cognitive dissonance that makes you see the world in a different way from other people. And so actually, rather than making you engage more in crime, it could actually deter you more from engaging in crime, depending on the nature of the cognitive dissonance bias. So again, yes, there could be cognitive dissonance bias, but how does it impact criminal decision making? I think it's not clear. And again, I don't think you can come up with a very good theory on why we go one way or the other. And actually, if you try to do some empirical study here, it's going to be extremely important. Now, there are, of course, certain crimes that might benefit from a behavioral explanation, right? And I've done myself some work with Professor Damika Dharmapala at U Chicago on hate crimes. Right? Hate crimes are really sort of a problem for economists because that means first you decide to commit a crime, whatever underlying action, theft, mugging, beating, sexual violence, whatever crime people commit, but then you add a sort of racist bias or a gender bias. That is, you have particular hate against a certain group of people, and that's why you're committing that crime against a certain individual because he belongs or she belongs to another specific group of people. Now, economists sort of it gets hard because why do people do these things? Well, it's their preferences, right? But that's not a very interesting explanation for why we think people just have a racist preference to commit crimes against a specific group or a specific gender. It's just not the most interesting way to look at this. And then it's very hard to sort of come up with a policy implication because that means in litigation, in criminal litigation, you would need to make a distinction between the underlying motivation and the hate motivation, right? And if people are rational, they should hide their hate motivation. Because if you're saying, if you have a hate motivation, you're going to create a greater penalty than if you just do this without a hate motivation, then of course your dominant strategy would be to say, I did this because I want to do a crime, not because I have any sort of hate motivation, right? So it's very hard to see how you can really make some economic contribution here within the rational model. We cannot really explain the preferences. We cannot explain how to change these preferences. And then if these preferences are true, and that's what's going on, then of course the dominant strategy would be to hide these preferences and make enforcement actually more difficult rather than easier for the authorities. So I think you need some behavioral insights here, in particular when you start thinking about some sort of self-interest, limited rationality, and in particular notions of altruism. And in fact, this would be the opposite of altruism. That's hate, right? So if you start trying to explain hate from an economic point of view, I think you need to bring in the models of altruism and why people feel the opposite of altruism in relation to other people. So for example, notions of positive and negative reciprocity. As you know, there's a huge literature on positive and negative reciprocity. Why is that we engage in positive reciprocity or negative reciprocity absent of any sort of prior interactions, right? Because economists, we can explain reciprocity in a repeat game. It's just interactions. If you're nice to me, I'm nice to you. In a repeat game, quite easily, because we want to get away from the prisoner's dilemma. And so we interact many times until we trust each other. And that's why we have reciprocity. Because if you punish me, I will punish you. That's well taken in game theory. That's well taken in repeat games. That's easy to explain. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about positive or negative reciprocity in absence of any sort of interactions, right? Why do I smile to other people I don't know? Or why do I hate people I don't know? I've never interacted before, but I just look at the person and I don't like the person. Or differently, I look at the person and I smile and like the person. This is what we call positive and negative reciprocity. And we can't really explain this rationally. We need some behavioral insights like social norms, like biology, disposition, like some sort of body language, some sort of emotional reaction that we need to bring in. So bottom line, personally, I don't think behavioral law and economics as a model to replace the classical model of crime. So it's not like, okay, we should just, get rid of Becker and move to behavioral law and economics. Again, if you like these sort of topics, I think the best paper is by Richard McAdams and Tom Ulen. It's online at SSRN. You can just Google behavioral crime, criminal law and economics, Ulen and McAdams. You'll find the paper. It's about 10 years old. It is a very careful survey of arguments. But I think their conclusion is the same as mine, is to say, well, the Beckerian model as a starting point is still useful. But for some sort of crimes, we may need behavioral insights. So for crimes that involve hate motivation, for crimes that involve, as I think was Renita last time asking about emotional crimes, you need to go into behavioral law and economics. You need to explain where these emotions are coming from and why they are relevant, right? Because if you stick to the rational model and you just say, well, an emotional crime is a crime where the benefit is infinite and the cost is negligible. And that's why it always happens. You cannot deter the emotional person because the emotional person is not doing cost benefit analysis. That's really tautological. That's really not very relevant for policy, because then you're saying there's nothing we can do about emotional crimes. These are crimes where the benefit always outweighs the cost. They're not deterrable. There's nothing we can do about this. And therefore, every emotional person should be put in jail, because every emotional person is a potential criminal that we cannot deter. I don't think you want to go that direction. It's not very interesting. It does not bring any sort of policy discussion, useful policy discussion. So I think if that's what we're trying to sort of look at, then we have to go behavioral and try to find, framing effect, optimism, law and emotions. As you know, there's been some work on law and neurology and trying to explain how your brain works and why your brain perceives information. I think that's a more useful model to think about this. But again, for very specific crimes. I don't think you need behavioral law and economics to explain white collar crime, to explain mugging, to explain compliance with traffic law, to explain corporate criminal activities. All of those, I think you can easily explain with a rational model, and you can very seriously have policy implications if you look at how probability and severity of punishment operates in that setting. Okay, yes, Ren, I was going to open for discussions before I go for the next topics. Yeah, Renita, let's go ahead.
Professor, I was thinking why hate crimes cannot be answered, by the Becker's model, because there are clear costs and benefits for all kinds of hate crimes also. The kind of signaling, the kind of identity.
But the problem is, you cannot really explain. Of course, you can do the Becker model. I did it, so I'm guilty as charged, because my paper applies the Becker model to hate crimes. But the problem is, you cannot really explain where the hate motivation is coming from. You can just say some people hate and other people do not hate, but you cannot come up with a good explanation where is this hate motivation coming from. And if you want to have a very complete policy discussion, it would be useful to understand why is that some people hate other people and some people don't hate. That's the concern. I'm not a big fan of explanations based on systemic racism and all of those things. But I think once you're talking about hate crimes, you have to go into that literature and try to explain why is that people have this sort of hate against other people, right? It's a bit like, it's not just hate crimes. Sexual violence to a large extent is the same discussion. I mean, is this sexual violence a cost-benefit analysis, or the fact is that some male really have some sort of hate against female, and that's why we see so much sexual violence. And even if you believe that some male hate women for whatever reason, why is that? I mean, again, we can come up with the patriarchal arguments, sure, but that's not going to change very soon, and we need to understand why we have this sort of behavior, right? So in that respect, although I'm an economist, as you know, I do think if we want to have that discussion, we need to go to psychology. We can't just stay in economics to try to explain these things. More questions? Again, I'm not saying we should give up on economics, because if we should give up on economics, then I think this session is over, right? We should say, okay, we are over, we give up. Let's move to psychology. Let's call some psychology people and explain us what's going on. So I'm not saying that, because otherwise I will be without a job, and many of you will be without a job. So that's not good news. I still think economists have a role to play here. But I do think when we move from sort of a general framework to try to explain particular crimes or particular segments of the population, we need to bring in some of the psychology insights to try to understand what's going on. Remember, I mean, many of you are quite young, but and that's not because I'm too old. But when I studied 30 years ago, for example, you still had people writing books saying that crime only exists in capitalism societies. In socialist societies, there is no crime. And the idea would be that in socialist societies, people would be so happy and so friendly and so nice to each other that crime would disappear completely. We do now know that crime was pretty stiff in the Soviet Union. And I mean theft, assault, robbery, sexual violence, all sorts of crimes were quite common in the Soviet Union, even having a very strict law enforcement by the police. So that means that crime is somehow intrinsic to human behavior and does not seem to depend on whatever sort of economic society, economic model you're living. However, it is true that some countries have more crime than others, and in particular, the United States has, or used to have, I mean, things have been changing in the last 10 years, but used to have more violent crime than Europe. And there's always been a discussion, why is that United States has more violent crime? And this may have to do with demographics, obviously, but it also the fact that United States as a country is a very violent country compared to, say, Sweden or Norway or Denmark. And so there's an aspect that has to do with the psychology and the social norms of the country. Of course, we also have the discussion, as you know, in the United States about gun possession. Now, that's where you realize that I am not American, because, of course, I cannot understand the Second Amendment. Although I've been living in the United States for 25 years, I still don't understand the Second Amendment, that people are crazy to have guns and they love guns and they love to collect guns at home. That's something that it's just cultural. It's beyond my personal understanding. But of course, that reflects cultural values. And we need to also acknowledge that a lot of crime reflects cultural values. And that might explain why you have more violent crime in the United States than, say, you have in Sweden or in Norway. The argument of the gun possession is actually not that a good explanation in terms of the physical possession of guns, because violent crime rates have been going down in the US for the last 10 to 15 years when gun possession is going up. So it does not seem to be that the gun possession explains directly violent crime, because you would expect then crime rates to go up. They haven't gone up, they've been going down, but it could be a reflection of social values, community values, and social norms that are relevant to explain crime. Okay, before I move to econometrics, any more questions on this discussion? Again, I mean, I'm not taking a very polarized side here. So I am an economist. I like the rational model. I do think there's some value to behavioral model. Of course, if you read other economists, they may have completely different views on this. Some people really oppose the behavioral model. Other people think that the rational model is just useless in terms of predictions. Okay, there are two things I still want to talk about today. One are implications for criminal procedure, because so far we haven't really talked about criminal law. We're just talking about crimes in the sense of social harm, negative externality. We haven't really talked about criminal law as such. And the other one is, of course, what's been the most expanding area in the last 10 years, which is econometrics of crime. So let me start first with econometrics of crime as economists, and then we'll go to more legal aspects. So let's see why this has happened. First, because we have an explosion of data now. We have a lot of data about crime in many countries, and at a very micro level. There's a lot of surveys of criminals, lots of surveys of people in jail, lots of surveys of the population, of attitudes. So you have a lot of available data now that was not available 20 years ago. A lot of victim surveys, a lot of police surveys. So we have so much data now that we can do a lot of things. The other is that in the last 20 years, many countries, and in particular in the US, many states have made changes to their criminal policy. So you can then study what econometricians call event studies. You can try to compare things before the event and after the event and try to see if anything changed in the population. These are not just studies of deterrence. They're also studies of incapacitation, studies of dispersion of crime, as we saw last week, across counties, across states. These are studies about attitudes, and these are studies about effectiveness. But let's remember how all this started. Right? So after the Becker wrote his paper and published in 1968, a lot of the critique by criminologists and sociologists was, this is all wrong because there's no such thing as a deterrent effect. It doesn't exist. Unfortunately, most of the empirical studies by criminologists and sociologists for a long time were qualitative studies, something that economists don't really like. And many of these qualitative studies were like, we asked people in jail, seems like, would you be deterred by a more severe sanction? And 90% said no. So there's no deterrent effect. We asked the general public, if we double or triple sanctions, would you be less willing to commit the crime? And 98% said, no, we never commit crimes because we are, law-abiding citizens. So that shows there's no deterrent effect. So a lot of this evidence was qualitative. And so economists were very upset about this. And Isaac Ehrlich was the first economist to try to come up with a quantitative study. Now, you have to understand, he published his study in the AER in 1973. It's very important to understand the timing. At this point, remember, the United States had gone through an experiment, which the Supreme Court in the mid-1960s suspended the death penalty, right? And so you had an experiment because you had a period before 1960, I think it's 63 or 64, you had the death penalty, and after 1964, there was no death penalty. Remember, the death penalty in the United States was reinstated in the 1980s when the court became more conservative. But in the 1960s, it's a very progressive court, as you know, and it goes up to the 1970s. And one of the decisions of this very progressive court was to suspend the death penalty based on the grounds that's inhumane and potentially violates constitutional rights. So what Ehrlich does in 1973 is to say, I'm going to take the time series of violent crime since the 1940s until 1972, and I'm going to test by a dummy variable if the event in the 1960s affected the crime rate. And basically what he concludes is that since we abolished the death penalty, we have more violent crime. In fact, it comes up with a number that for each execution that we're not doing, we're getting 7 additional murders. So his argument was that each execution in the death penalty saves 7 lives. Now, as you can imagine, this was a highly controversial study. First, because such a large number, 7 lives, which seems not very intuitive. And second, because there was all discussions about other things are going on at the same time that you need to control for. Now, true, now in 2023, we know that the time series Ehrlich did in 1973 is wrong because he did not control for trend effects. Those of you who have done econometrics know you cannot do time series studies with a positive trend. You need to stabilize the residuals. You need to go into co-integration econometrics. You cannot just pick the data, run observation in year t equals alpha plus beta observation in year t minus 1 plus the event, and run this regression OLS. This is not going to be a good regression because, as you know, there's going to be autocorrelation of the residuals. So your OLS is wrong. But in 1973, they didn't know that. And so that's what he did. Now, to be fair to Ehrlich, as econometrics evolved, he rerun the regressions later with a better technique, and he still got a positive result, but no longer 7 lives, way fewer, probably 0.3 or 0.4 lives. He also rerun the regressions after the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty. So now with 2 events, you have 2 event studies. You have the suspension of the death penalty in the 1960s. You have the reinstatement of the death penalty at the end of the 70s, early 80s. So you can rerun these regressions. He still found some positive effect. However, as we got better data, data by state, different data, individual data on perpetrators of these crimes, race, gender, age, panel data. Many people have done these studies again with much better techniques, and we could say that at this point, the evidence suggests if there is any sort of deterrent effect of the death penalty, it's a very marginal, minor effect. Okay. Now, that's not really surprising if you think intuitively. I mean, you would not expect in a country of 350 million people that 200 executions a year, if that much, would have a tremendous impact. In particular, because they concentrated, as you know, in 2 or 3 states, basically Texas and some of the southern states. And so why would such small number of executions have huge impacts on 350 million population country would be sort of really ridiculous. So obviously, estimations of saving 7 lives or even more do not seem intuitive from that point of view. Now, having said that, this expanded to a more general discussion. The death penalty is not the only discussion, right? Of course, there's another area of controversy, which is gun possession. You also have many studies now about the impact of gun possession in the crime rates. Again, studies are divided, and if you know your econometrics, you can see the problem. Again, you have a significant identification problem. Why? Because if you think possessing guns leads to more crime, you can also think that more crime leads to more possession. Because if there's more crime, I want to defend myself, so I buy more guns. And so you have an identification problem, because you have that more guns means more crime, but you also have that more crime means more guns. So you cannot just run an OLS on crime rate equals alpha plus beta gun possession at time t in state I, because this regression, again, is going to be spurious given the fact that most likely your residuals are going to be autocorrelated. So how do we fix this? Well, one possibility, we use instrumental variables, right? So that's what Steve Levitt and others in Chicago have tried to do, is to use some sort of instrumental variables control. And when they do it, they don't find any big effect on guns. Other people have done what we call spatial variance studies, right? Which is spatial variance studies, which is, okay, for example, where I live in DC, you cannot have a gun. You cannot possess guns. But in the state of Virginia, which is just 5 minutes from here, or in the state of Maryland, which is another 5 minutes from here, you can have guns. So what they try to do is using the difference between DC, Virginia, and Maryland to study if crime rates in DC, Virginia, and Maryland are affected by these different laws. Now, the problem, as you can imagine, is displacement. That is, these studies would be very easy if criminals in Virginia stay in Virginia, criminals in Maryland stay in Maryland, and criminals in DC stay in DC. Then you could compare, and controlling for other things, you could say, oh, DC has lower crime rates because there's no gun possession, or the opposite. DC has higher crime rates, which in fact it has higher crime rates because of guns are not being allowed. Why can't you do this? Simple, because there is displacement. People circulate. So you could say, well, the problem is, yes, guns are not allowed in DC, but criminals with guns in Virginia go into DC, commit crimes, and go back to Virginia. The same with criminals from Maryland. They go into C and come back to Maryland. So you need some other mechanism to try to experiment why this might be relevant. Some of the studies are quite complex and quite intriguing. Again, the overall conclusion seems to be guns don't play a major role in explaining different crime rates across states. So the studies, again, are quite robust, quite complex, but do not give us any sort of exciting news in terms of gun possession. Economists have moved to other studies, more general. So what can we say? If you have an interest in the topic of the econometrics of crime, I recommend a paper in the Journal of Economic Literature, 2017, by McCarty, and I'm blinking on the other. It's in the Journal of Economic Literature, 2017. It's a very good survey of all the econometrics of crime and all the results we know and all the techniques and the good techniques and the bad techniques. And I think overall, if you take a very big picture of so many studies, I mean, they count more than 3,000 studies right now, 3,000 papers on crime, which, as you can imagine, is a huge, huge literature. And what they sort of conclude is, okay, there is some deterrence effect. That seems to be true. Not as strong as the economists think, but there is some strength, in fact. Sanctions, more severe sanctions, are usually related with less crime. So there's a negative correlation there, with a lot of caveats and a lot of context, but there seems to be a negative correlation, as Becker indicated. Probabilities are more of a problem. The results are mixed. So, for example, when you hire more police, it's not clear that crime rates go down. Depends on a lot of things. In particular, for example, what you do with your police. Putting more police on the street, yes, seems to be correlated with less crime. But more police doing paperwork or staying at the police station does not seem to be correlated with less crime. The introduction of technology in criminal investigation, DNA, all sorts of better technology, doesn't seem to have any effect on crime rates, right? I mean, you could think with DNA, now I'm much more likely to be caught if I commit murder or if I commit sexual violence. It's easier to prove now with DNA tests and all of DNA evidence. So you could say, I expect these sort of crimes to go down. Not really. DNA evidence, DNA technology has improved enforcement, has improved punishment, but does not seem to have major effects on violent crime rates. So doesn't seem to be indicating a lot of what you would expect as an economist. One possible problem that it could be is, going back to our discussion on behavioral, is how people compute probabilities, right? How do we know what's the probability? What's our perception of the probability? And it could be things that are quite complicated, and therefore most people do not do easy calculations of probabilities, right? I mean, of course, in traffic offenses, that's much easier. You just look around, and if there's no radar, no police officer, no nothing, you could think, okay, the probability is low, or and if there's a police officer, the probability is high. But when you think about other things, like, you know, tax evasion, white-collar crime, regulatory violations, it could be that the way people compute probability is just too noisy, and that's why we don't see big empirical results there. Another big discussion now empirically is recidivism, right? Again, I don't have the numbers for India, but I'm guessing it should not be very different from the United States. In the United States, it's calculated that about 60% of crime, violent crime, is committed by recidivists. That is, people who already been in jail and serve their term back on the street and do it again. So there's a lot of discussion. Why is that? Why is that people do it again? And of course, one line of argument is economic. People just, when they go back, they don't have income programs. They don't have any money, so they commit crimes to get money, to get a living. Other have to do with sort of failure of rehabilitation. That is, when you go to jail, you actually become worse rather than a better citizen, because jails really do not provide you with education, with any way of changing your preferences. They provide you with violence, more violence, a worse environment, and so you just become more criminal after you get out of jail. Other arguments have to do with something that I think was Sarah asking one question. Could be police reporting. That is, every time there's a crime, the police just goes after the usual suspects. Who are the usual suspects? People who already been in jail. And so essentially what we have is over-reporting of recidivism, because we always go after the same people and we always find a way to blame the same people. And so when we look at the statistics, we just have the disproportional impact on people already being in jail because they're easily identifiable. There's a record of these people. So there are many explanations. Unfortunately, the empirical studies do not come up with an answer of which of them is really the most likely explanation. There's mixed evidence. There seems to be some indication that going to jail really increases your likelihood of recidivism. But then again, you have to think about the other consequences, right? I mean, this is not an argument against putting people in jail. This is an argument about what do we do with people in jail. And maybe we're just failing on re-educating, rehabilitating people. It's a bit sort of sad, and it's a bit of sort of a bad observation that we have so high rates of recidivism, because it seems to be the problem we're not able to solve, which is bring people back to being a decent citizen and avoid this sort of criminal violence. It also raises questions, as you know, in the United States in particular, about the war on drugs, right? A lot of people have been convicted to jail for minor drug offenses, like drug possession. And it's not clear this is the right policy, because if jail makes them a worse citizen, then actually you're bringing people who committed minor offenses into an environment where they're likely to be educated to commit worse offenses when they're out of jail. It's complicated, it's problematic, and is expensive, because alternative welfare programs are very nice on paper, but they are extremely expensive, and we need to think about the consequences. So bottom line, a lot of econometric developments, a lot of new empirical evidence, a lot of empirical studies. In fact, I would say 90% of this field is now empirical, not theoretical, but we have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to learn. And again, most of these empirical studies are US based. A few are European based. We need to know more about what's happening in the rest of the world to try to understand why people engage in criminal activities. Let me just do a remark here. Comparative cross-country work is a problem. And if you try to do any cross-country work, you have to remember that crimes are not the same across every country, right? I mean, criminal law is endogenous to each jurisdiction. And so when people start doing cross-country work, they have been very careful, because the way we define crimes, the way we criminalize actions, the way we make law enforcement is very different across countries, right? So when people want to do some sort of regression on crime rates across countries, on number of police officers, that's a typical study that many people want to do. Let's say if countries have more police per capita, do they have higher or lower crime rates? Well, you have to do this in a very careful way because you have to control for many other things, of course, demographics, economics, but also for the fact that the sort of crimes you're enforcing against in Sweden is not the same as in Russia or in the United States. So you need to be very careful that the way you're estimating these things might be extremely noisy. Of course, some crimes are crimes in every jurisdiction, which if you just compare, say, murder or sexual violence, that could be easier. But if you're comparing aggregate crime rates, you have to be extremely careful about what you're doing. And these studies that conclude that having more police officers does not decrease crime rates are very, very problematic because this might just be noise and not really a serious policy implication. Okay, so I think I'm going to suggest we make a break of about 10 minutes. And then I think I want to come back and talk a little bit about criminal procedure and criminal law rules that we haven't talked about so far. Is that okay? And then there will be time for questions. There will be time for questions at the end if people have questions.
That's perfect, Professor. We'll meet in 10 minutes. We'll meet.
Yes, let's say 9 minutes. Let's start at the hour. I know you guys, is it what, 9:30 or 10 or whatever is in?
In India, it is 7:20.
7:20. So let's start at 7:30.
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question for the participants here. Can I ask?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. So, what is the economics of keeping your videos off? Becker
Ma'am, it's
model.
the break time. It's the break time right now.
No, not now. I'm talking about the session. This is for everybody. So is it the Beckerian model or do we have some behavioral analysis going on there? What would it be?
Good evening, ma'am.
Becker or behavioral?
Behavioral.
So does that mean there is not much that law and policy can do about it? Is it like that? Dr. Binpreet, where are you?
Hello, ma'am. Good evening.
Very good evening. You're very, very audible but not visible. So that's what I'm asking. Is it the Beckerian model or the behavioral model?
Ma'am, it's just that this is the hour when it's like we are sitting in an informal home environment and it's not a very good idea to put on the camera. I'll be very honest.
I appreciate your honesty, absolutely.
Of course, yes.
Hmm?
Students are asking whether they can put their cameras off or not. I say that 10 minutes it's okay. You can put your cameras off.
It's just a request.
Just, please
It
listen.
just feels nice, to be able to see everybody. That's all.
Sure, ma'am.
I hope you started thinking of your extended abstract, everybody. So maybe putting your videos on is an option, but that is not. Extended abstracts, I hope you're kind of thinking about it. If you have questions on how to go about it, you can ask. You'll have to submit it. When is it, Ayush? When is the submission?
By 10th.
By 10th, yeah. So it's, there's just 2 more days. Like we said, you can have the option of reflective notes or extended abstracts. We'd also suggested extended abstracts would kind of be, it'll lead you to something more concrete. It will lead you to the possibility of writing a research paper. So yeah, I'm just reminding you 2 more days for those submissions.
And just a confirmation that all of you have received the mail regarding the reflective notes and abstract.
Yes, sir.
The last date for the submission is 10th.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
I'm back. Should we
Welcome,
start?
Professor. Welcome back.
Yes. Let me wait. Let's wait 20 seconds to see if people are back.
Yeah, people are back, but people are a little hesitant with the video because it's kind of 7:30 in India, so
No.
it's kind of off office hours.
Is 7:30 in India dinner time or before dinner? What time?
Pre-dinner time.
What time do you have dinner? Usually 8, 9?
I think 8:39 should be a good range.
So later than in the UK, because usually the UK is 7, something like that.
Later than that. Definitely later than that.
I had a friend here when I came to the United States. I had a friend who invited me to his home for dinner, and he said 5:30, and I said, "Is that late lunch?" Because I don't have dinner at 5:30, for God's sake. Or maybe that's the first dinner, and then I get a second dinner at 10 p.m. or something like that.
Or that could be a very, that could be a very cost-cutting dinner also.
Definitely was a cost-cutting dinner, for sure.
Professor, I've been wanting to ask you, we would really like to invite you to India.
Well,
Any plans?
yes, because next year, we can talk about next year, because next year I'm going to be on sabbatical, so I'll have more time to travel.
Yes, and please, India is a beautiful place for multiple reasons. So, take some time and come. Of course, we'll have academic work going, but also, you can see the.
I want to do some sightseeing. Yes, I want to do some sightseeing for sure.
So
let's talk about that. Yeah, let's talk about that. I think seriously we can try that. Once I'm on sabbatical, it's just easier because I'm not teaching, so it's more easier to accommodate your needs and my needs.
Yeah, we look forward to that, Professor. We can start now, I think.
Yes, we can start. So this is I'm going to talk about 20 minutes or less about procedure, and then we can open for questions. And the reason is, unfortunately, there's not a lot of work on criminal procedure. And the reason is that, as you can see from the Beckerian model, there's no procedure. It's all about the probability and severity of punishment. So there's no how you get there, what is criminal litigation, what's the role of the prosecutor, and all of the what's the role of evidence. Those are all black boxes in Becker. There's no way, there's nothing to explain what happens with the criminal justice system. And since the economists, myself, guilty as charged, we have been so worried about the sanctions and the probability, there was no much work on procedure, and only started in the last 20 years that people start saying, well, maybe the model economists have is just too simplistic, and we need to understand how to get to these probabilities by looking how the criminal justice system works. And so there's 2 or 3 areas where we have been doing, I think, work and where there's a lot of discussions. One big area, because Easterbrook, Judge Easterbrook, who used to be a professor at Chicago Law School, but is now a judge in the 7th Circuit, wrote a very famous paper in 1992 about plea bargaining. I don't know if that's something you have as a practice in India. Many jurisdictions do not like plea bargaining. The UK does not like plea bargaining. It's sort of expanded it in the last 15 years, but was not a big fan of plea bargaining. European countries in general don't like plea bargaining, but as you know, in the US, it's a big thing, plea bargaining. It's calculated that about 90% of convictions in the United States are through plea bargaining. That is, only 10% do actually go to trial. And so that's why we have what's called the vanishing trials, because everything is plea bargaining. Now, Easterbrook, as you can imagine, in 1992, his argument in favor of plea bargaining was an argument based on the notion of transaction costs. And his argument is that plea bargaining reduces transaction costs. It's like a contract. It's like a Coasian solution to this problem. The prosecutor and the defendant negotiate a solution, and that's sort of a Coasian solution. So it's more efficient because it reduces transaction costs and internalizes the externalities that both sides bear. And so the article in 1992 is very favorable to plea bargaining. In fact, he makes a very strong argument that judges should not oppose plea bargaining, right? Because the big issue in the United States is the extent to which judges oppose plea bargaining and can reject a plea deal between the prosecutor and the defendant. And his argument in paper is that that's wrong because it's increasing transaction costs. So judges should not interfere, parties should negotiate, and whatever you negotiate should be valid, and blah, blah, blah. It's all great, it's all efficient. Now, here's the problem very soon, as you can imagine. When you have a contract between two people, and assuming people are in their full capacity and understand the terms of the contract, which is a big if, but if people are in full capacity and understand the terms of the contract, then of course both sides will negotiate a solution that is better for both. And that's why this is efficient. And that's what you learn in your first class in contract economics or in contract law and economics, is that negotiations are good because the individuals will find an optimal solution to their problem where everyone is better off. That's a Pareto improvement. Now, the problem is when you bring that mindset to criminal litigation, the issue is the prosecutor does not necessarily represent the interests of the victim and of society. That is, on the side of the prosecutor, there could be a principal agent problem, that the prosecutor is not really representing the interests of society or of the victim, it's representing the interests of the prosecutor. On the other side, you have the same problem because the defendant's lawyer might not be representing the interests of the defendant, but the interests of the defendant's lawyer. So the problem with this plea bargaining contract is this is not between two free will individuals. It's between two agents of two principals. And we don't know, in fact, we suspect that there are serious principal agent problems here. And if there are serious principal agent problems here, the argument of reduction of transaction cost is way less valid because you don't know the extent to which there are misalignments between the principal and the agents, and these misalignments are inducing agency costs. So this becomes a big controversial area because then you have to understand how these plea bargaining contracts are negotiated and the extent to which they actually create agency costs. Many of the things we hear in the US is how the prosecutors and the public defenders or the defenders' attorneys negotiate by blocks. Like we have 20 criminals, I get 10 convicted, you get 10 acquitted, and let's do this in the morning, right? Most of the time when you go into the first criminal court to hear your arraignment, it's less than 5 minutes. It's very unlikely that this is going to be a negotiation in the full sense of the word. So I think plea bargaining is a problem. It does raise concerns. And there's a lot of obvious many papers, theoretical and empirical papers, trying to study plea bargaining. Let me just make one caveat here. One argument that people have against plea bargaining, a popular argument, is that plea bargaining leads innocent people to jail because innocent people are afraid of going to trial, and they accept these deals with the prosecutor because they think it's better to get a deal with the prosecutor than actually going to trial and then going to jail more years. Now, this argument is actually an incomplete argument because this argument is presupposing that there are no false positives in trial. Unfortunately, there are. So there's no evidence that plea bargaining leads more people to jail than trials would lead people to jail. Because the reason why people may accept plea bargaining, innocent people might accept plea bargaining, is because innocent people know they might also get convicted in a trial by a jury or by a judge. So the idea that plea bargaining is unfair because it leads innocent people to plead guilty just in exchange for a better sanction is not reflecting that the reason why we might have this is because trials in the first place are not perfect and convict people. So if you want to use that argument against plea bargaining, as an economist, what you need to show is that plea bargaining is worse for innocent people than trials. And that's way more difficult to show empirically, but that's the argument that you have to make, is that plea bargaining would be more detrimental to innocent people than bringing them to trial. Because just saying that plea bargaining leads innocent people to plead guilty, of course that happens, but that happens because these innocent people might be concerned about being convicted in trial, which means that trials also generate false positives. Okay, so that's one area, it's plea bargaining and all the discussion about plea bargaining. Another area is about evidence and the rules of evidence. So one big discussion is the fact of mandatory disclosure. So again, I don't know exactly in India, but being a common law jurisdiction, usually in the common law, the prosecution has to disclose all evidence before trial. That is, you cannot go into criminal trial with the prosecution withholding evidence from the defendant. And of course, any new evidence brought by the prosecution has to prove that that evidence was produced after the trial started. Now, two problems with this rule, or two ways to look at the rule. One is, of course, you're trying to help the defendant. So this rule is a pro-defendant rule because the defendant usually does not have to share his or her evidence with the prosecution. So it's a one-way rule, and fundamentally, it's a rule that protects the defendant. The problem, again, is how it impacts the prosecution. Because you could say, well, it's good because the prosecution has to share evidence. But the problem with the mandatory disclosure rule of evidence, which you might know from if you do law and economics of civil procedure rather than criminal procedure, you have the same discussion there, is any mandatory disclosure rule means that the information gathered by the prosecution is a public good, because the prosecution has to share this information with other people. The problem with the public good, as we all know, is that it leads to underproduction and the provision of the good. Why? Because since you have to share, you have less incentives to invest yourself in that provision of a good, because the benefit to you has been reduced. You have to share that good with everybody else. And so the question is the extent to which rules of mandatory disclosure in criminal litigation lead to worse prosecution. That is, they reduce the quality of the prosecution because the prosecution is less incentivized to search for information. And again, empirically, this is hard to study because you don't have counterfactuals, but there are some theoretical models where you can easily show that the problem with making full disclosure is you create lower quality of prosecution, and with lower quality of prosecution, you have lower quality of outcomes in trial. So putting in context, we have to be really careful how these rules are going to affect the incentives of the prosecution. And so mandatory disclosure rules of evidence are problematic, and we should be careful. We should be careful about their impact in criminal litigation. Another area, of course, where I mean, there's also, for example, as you know, the exclusionary rules, right? Rules about what you have to exclude from evidence, right? Should you include information?
Professor, sorry to intervene. There's a question. I think one participant has a hand is up.
I don't see anyone, but please go ahead if you have a question.
Sir, actually, I wanted to ask you, so mandatory disclosure could also mean that later on the chances of the prosecution getting overturned is less because everyone has seen the evidence, everyone has done their due diligence. So when it goes to, like, for example, in India, if it goes on to the High Court or the Supreme Court level, then the chances that that evidence is questioned would be less. So wouldn't that incentivize the prosecution to do a better job?
Yes, but again, depends on the context. The issue is, in fact, as you know, technically the prosecutor has the duty has his own professional responsibility. So the question should not even be raised from a pure ethical perspective. The issue is essentially how the prosecutors manage cases, right? And so the issue here is the extent to which you want to gather evidence, and by gathering evidence, you also find exculpatory evidence, right? The problem is you might find evidence that helps the prosecutor and evidence that does not help the prosecutor. Now, the mandatory rule, of course, is to force the prosecutor not to hide evidence that doesn't help the prosecutor. You don't want the prosecutor to hide that information. So that's a positive effect. The negative effect is how does it affect the strategy of the prosecutor? Because on top of what you're saying, in the case of the US, you also have the issue of plea bargaining, right? And so how much evidence do you want to have in order to engage in plea bargaining is sort of a problem, because what sort of cases are disposed by plea bargaining and what sort of cases go to trial is also not clear. Because if you only want to trial cases that you can win as a prosecutor easily, then these are cases where you want to look for evidence against the defendant, but you don't want to find evidence that favors the defendant, because that will make the case weaker and therefore more likely to have to go through plea bargaining than to go to trial. So depending how you model the incentives of the prosecutor, you may have different arrangements. For example, what I was going to say before you asked your question, actually raised your question, is evidence that you're not supposed to present, right? So, for example, the rules of excluded evidence. So, for example, in the United States, most of the time, you're not supposed to present evidence about past convictions of the defendant, unless they have direct bearing in the crime that's on trial, right? So if you cannot show that a past conviction has a direct bearing on the crime in trial, you cannot submit that evidence to the court. But here's the problem. juries might actually do some form of induction when they do not see any evidence about the past, right? So when you go to trial and you don't see any evidence submitted by the prosecutor about the past, what do you infer? Do you infer that this person had no prior record? Or do you infer that this person may have a prior record, but simply should not, the prosecutor is not allowed to submit to the court because of the rules of evidence? And in fact, if you think most people relate prior record to certain demographics, let's say black man, then in fact this rule is going to create a problem to many black male defendants, because the jury is going to assume because you're a black man, you must have some prior record. It's just the rules don't allow the prosecutor to submit. And so you overgeneralize prior existence of prior convictions that in fact might not exist. Whereas if you are, say, a white female, where we think that most of the time they don't have any prior record, I don't see any submission, then I infer that you have no prior record, so I'm actually more predisposed in favor of you. So you see how the evidence rules might actually be more complicated, because the fact that evidence is not presented does not necessarily mean that the jury or the judge does not infer from not presenting some other conclusion. Now we can say this is not ethical, that's what you're not supposed to do. The rules to the jury are that you're not supposed to think about other things, but the fact is people do make inferences. And so a lot of the consequences of these rules are complicated because you have to think about how the different players are going to react. Also, on the other hand, another possible problem of mandatory disclosure is the impact on the defendant's side. Now, it could be that if I'm the defendant and I know the prosecution has to share all the evidence with me, I have less incentives to actually do my own evidence search, because I just wait and see what the prosecution has. Of course, there's going to be a difference between situations where I am a wealthy defendant and I have money to search for evidence versus when I have a public defender with no money and therefore I simply have no money, I just wait. And that's what happens in reality in most cases, that people make no such effort because they have no resources and they have a public defender, and they just wait for the prosecution to show what they have, which again could bias the evidence in trial. So depend on many factors here. You may want to go in different directions. I think the bottom line is just to say that rules of evidence in criminal procedure might be more problematic than we think about them, and might be more consequences and strategic incentives than one might actually think exist. I hope that answered your question, Sarah. Let me just add one final aspect I wanted to mention here before we sort of stop, is the problem. Some of the literature I've also written about this, about punitive preferences. So far, we're assuming that police and prosecutors are all nice people and they do what they're supposed to do and they are efficient and all of that. Well, I mean, they're just human beings like anybody else. So we need to understand their preferences. So here's one of the problems I think we have, is that if you want to be a nasty person, and if you want to be violent and be legally violent at the same time, what should be your job? A police officer. If you like to put people in jail and you don't like people, what should be your job? A prosecutor. So that means you may have some adverse selection in the recruitment of police officers and prosecutors. I don't mean they're nasty people. I mean their preferences are at the tail of the distribution of our society, right? If you are someone who does not believe in law enforcement and someone who believes in, we should all be nice people and sing kumbaya and just peace and love, you're very unlikely to want to become a police officer or a prosecutor. So we have different preferences in our society. Some people are more punitive than others. Some people think criminals are nastier than others. But these preferences in our society are not going to be equally represented in the prosecution or in the police, because you're more likely to attract punitive individuals into the police and into the prosecution, in particular if the salaries are not very good. Then people might want to go there for their own preferences. This creates a problem, because that means we're going to have overwhelmingly punitive prosecutors and police with goals misaligned with society. If that's what we have, then we have to be careful about rules of evidence and and bylaws on police behavior and prosecutor behavior, because they may be over incentivized to convict individuals. And so we may need mechanisms to under incentivize them, right? I've already mentioned here the example, very obvious, up to the 18th century, of English judges being paid as a percentage of the award to the plaintiff, which creates obviously a pro-plaintiff procedure, because the judges have an interest in convicting in order to get paid. So what should we do? We need pro-defendant rules, because we have to overturn the incentives of the way we pay judges. So here is the same argument. If we think the prosecutors and the police are extremely punitive, then we need pro-defendant rules to sort of constrain the police and constrain the prosecutors. As we know, we actually wrote a paper on this about 5 years ago, well before George Floyd and all the crisis in the United States, where we already indicated that one of the problems in the United States is that the rules of police, the law of police, is not good enough to unravel these incentives. That is, the law of police must be such that actually makes police more difficult to be punitive. Otherwise, we're going to have over-punishment, over-detection by the police, which is just not efficient, and we need to take care of this. Okay, so overall, the literature on criminal procedure is plea bargaining and the effects of plea bargaining, the merits and demerits of plea bargaining, rules of evidence, and how the rules of evidence create mechanisms that might be detrimental to the defendant or to the prosecution, and then finally, the preferences of the prosecutors, of the police, being self-selected through the population, and the extent to which they are more punitive than the rest of the population. And so that creates a need for rules of evidence that constrain the police, constrain the prosecution, to try to sort of undermine those punitive preferences. Okay, I'll stop here in terms of introducing material. I think we covered a lot of things. I think I'll open for questions or comments, or whatever people want to say about criminal law and economics. Sarah, go ahead. I think is that your hand? Yes.
Yes, sir. So, sir, I just want to explain. I'll just give you a brief on. So, we are currently staying in Gujarat. So, in Gujarat, consumption of alcohol is prohibited. So often now, what happens is that in cases of sexual violence, if both the victim and the perpetrator are consuming alcohol, that means that the victim is also part of an illegal activity, which essentially makes it difficult for the victim to approach the police. So, I just want to ask you, so is it correct when I say that this would also mess with the statistics because there will be underreporting of crimes, and it will also increase the optimistic bias of the perpetrator because they will assume that if both me and the victim are drinking, the victim is less likely to report the case. And so, in conclusion, by prohibiting alcohol, can we say that we are incentivizing people to commit sexually violent crimes?
So I think there are two issues. One is the data issue. I think you're correct there. If victims themselves, by reporting the victimization, are also reporting a crime, of course you'll have fewer reporting, and that means your official statistics will be underestimating the existence of that crime. I think from a pure statistical point of view, the only way to go around that would be for the state to introduce some sort of victim survey where people anonymously would respond to a survey and try to see if you can find a difference between the official rates and how victims report. Of course, with all the caveats I mentioned, that handling victim services has to be very careful and done by people who know what they're doing. As a second question, I think at the theoretical model, it's a bit more complicated than that. Depends on the elasticities, right? Because you could also argue, your argument is correct. The counter argument would be if the penalty for being consuming alcohol and committing a sexual offense is way worse, is way more severe than just the sexual offense, then you could argue by marginal deterrence you would have the opposite effect. That is, if I know that by being drunk my penalty is going to be even way worse than my penalty if I'm not drunk, then I would have an incentive not to be drunk. So my guess from what you're saying is that probably if you commit sexual violence and also you were consuming alcohol, that the penalty from the alcohol is not going to be way more severe than the penalty for the sexual offense. And if that's the case, then of course the elasticities would go in the direction you are arguing. That is, because in a way it will reduce the probability of reporting by the victim, and so that's the most likely effect. But we would, I mean, in theory, if we don't have statistics, we could go both ways. I can imagine a system where, let's say, if I commit sexual violence and I get 5 years, but if I commit sexual violence with consumption of alcohol and I get 25 years, because the alcohol is 20 years, then it actually might deter me from consuming alcohol, even knowing that if we consume alcohol, the victim is less likely to report, but there's a huge gap of 20 years. So again, I think it would depend on the elasticities.
Sir, but in cases of sexual violence and like grave sexual violence, the penalty goes up to death penalty in a few cases. So, if the act is that violent, then that would also incentivize the perpetrator to actually kill the victim and get rid of the body. So, so like here, where the perpetrator thinks that okay, the reason that they kill the victim, is that because this person might go and report the case. But if there is even a slight possibility that due to because they were an equal participant in in another criminal activity, wouldn't that uh, like have an effect on this entire situation?
Yes, yes, but what you're saying is exactly an application of the marginal deterrence problem. If you're saying that for extreme sexual violence, you get the death penalty, then of course you are incentivizing the perpetrator to eliminate the victim. Or you know, the whole story about the alcohol makes no difference anymore. So that would be in a situation, in a very extreme situation, where the marginal deterrence principle is being violated. And so from a marginal deterrence point of view, there should be a distinction between extreme sexual violence and murder, or you know, or killing the victim, because otherwise you actually are inducing perverse incentives. That was also the discussion in the UK in the late 1990s, and that's why, in my view, you know, sexual violence, no matter how extreme, should not be sanctioned the same way as murder or homicide, or you know, a more serious felony.
Thank you.
Yes, there's another hand there. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Hello, sir. Actually, my question is, what economic insights can be applied to understand the causes and consequences of wrongful conviction and how to minimize their occurrence?
So first of all, we need to understand that, as you know, that has been an issue since the days of Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato. So this is not, we're not going to solve it now. We have been thinking about this for 3,000 years and we haven't solved it. I think there are two important issues. As economists, one issue is, what is the appropriate ratio, right? I mean, Blackstone came up with a 10 ratio. Is that the appropriate number? And that should reflect social costs, right? And I think that's where we can do more work, even from an econometric point of view, is try to estimate what are the costs of false convictions and false acquittals. And I think a lot of these things are not studied, so people don't really know what are the consequences of this. Of course, recidivism is one possible consequence, that people do it again and again because they keep getting acquitted. But putting people in jail, how that also affects people. Now, remember, until DNA was available, we also didn't have a very good idea how many false positives we have, right? I mean, since we have DNA, one of the problems is we concluded, at least in the US, that for very serious crimes, we actually had more false positives than we thought we had. A lot of people were wrongly convicted, more people than we actually thought were wrongly convicted. A lot of people, for example, criticize the death penalty because we know how many wrong people were convicted of the death penalty. But the only reason we know that is because we have a lot of due process and a lot of information. For less serious convictions, we actually have no idea what these rates are. I mean, how many people are in jail for drug offenses, for wrongful convictions of drug offenses? We have no idea. Nobody has studied this. Nobody cares about this. So that's the first thing. We need to sort of get to where we are in that respect. The second, I think, is more on thinking if rules of evidence, if procedure is actually harming or helping the ratio, right? And for example, the big discussion in the US is For wrongful convictions, is it worse a jury trial or a judge trial? And the arguments are quite powerful because there are two issues. Juries are much more driven by emotion rather than by facts. Is that helpful or not? Unclear. Judges are driven by facts, but then by facts we mean technicalities. And then do we want people to be exonerated or convicted on the basis of technicalities? Not clear. And so I think economics can bring in the trade-offs. I don't think we can go to the government and tell the government we have a solution to the problem. And here's a solution and you should do this solution. But I think we can tease out a lot of the problems that I think many times lawyers are less likely to be concerned, because one of the problems with people who have a sort of a traditional law education is that they don't understand very well trade-offs. Because the thing with economists is that you're formatted to think about trade-offs. You always see everything as a trade-off. Lawyers usually don't see this as a trade-off, and I think that's the role of the economist, is to bring in the trade-offs. There's a trade-off. And so in a way, economists are pessimistic because we never have a magic solution. We are always saying, yes, there's a benefit, but there's also a cost. Nothing is a magic bullet. But in this area, I think the issue is the trade-offs, and try to persuade lawyers, look, evidence rules have trade-offs. You think you're helping these guys, you may actually not be helping because you're creating problems on this other side. And so I think that's the role of economists in this context.
So there is a question in the chat box from Abhijit Chanda.
The chat box.
The question.
Which question?
Whether the process of the judicial system has a lot to do in balancing the economics with law in a sovereign state, by Abhijit.
Oh, I'm sorry, I see the questions now. I stopped at some question up there and I didn't get. Okay, there's a few questions here. Okay. Well, let me go from the last question to earlier questions. Yes, repeat crimes is a problem because unfortunately, from an economic point of view, it's sort of a puzzle. Let's see why. If a crime is an externality, and what you're trying to force is the internalization of the externality, and each sanction internalizes this externality, then largely speaking, your second and third crimes should be independent of the first crime. Because every time you commit a crime, you internalize the externality. So from an economics point of view, the sanctions should be largely independent. Is for each crime you commit, you create a social damage, you pay for that social damage, you internalize the externality, so your next crime should be completely independent from your first crime. So unfortunately, from an economic point of view, we need to come up with some smart argument for why second and third violations matter. Now, one possible argument is a learning effect. Is you suspect when people commit several crimes, they're also learning how to commit crimes. They're getting better at committing crimes. And if you think there's a learning effect, then of course it makes sense to have increasing fines for these crimes. Because now the issue is that these people are becoming better at becoming criminals, so they have to be more deterred. So that's why your crime sanctions should go up. So the fine for the second violation should be more than the fine for the first violation, not because the externality is different, but because there's a learning effect. Okay, I hope my argument was clear. Because if you internalize the externalities, then your fines should be completely independent for the first, second, and third. Yeah, go ahead.
Can we say
that by raising the sanctions, we are minimizing the utility of the crime itself.
Yes, exactly. So if your utility of the first, second, and third are independent, so your sections should be independent. The only reason why they might be dependent, why they're related, is because there might be more reasons, of course, but one reason would be the learning effect. So that's the standard argument that we present to justify why you see this escalation of sanctions.
Okay.
There's some other hand there. Go ahead.
Sir, as you said before, sanctions and punishments don't really have a huge effect on crime rates. So, why isn't opting for, and you've also talked about how prison makes people worse and how they're more likely to commit crime even after coming out of prison. So, why isn't opting for welfare programs a better option? Why doesn't, even though it's expensive, shouldn't it be a better and more viable option in the longer run?
But that's exactly what you're saying. What you need to do is sort of show that the cost of the welfare program actually generate more benefits. And the welfare program, I mean, the studies in the US are sort of mixed. For example, one welfare program that seems to work quite well is to provide some working experience while you are in jail, and then give these sort of criminals some money when they get out of jail to open their business. And this seems to work quite well in some states like Arizona and California. But if you, for example, make them work in jail with no payment, that does not seem to work. So people don't like that. So you have to sort of think how you can do these welfare programs, because some are successful, some are not successful. And of course, this also depends on, you cannot apply them to everyone. Of course, for more violent criminals, maybe welfare programs are not the best way to address this. But for people who do, you know, some minor drug related, some minor crime, this would be the best way. I mean, people who do this for economic reasons, because they don't have a job, because they have no money, this might be a way to sort of get them back into a job, like work while you're in jail, and then you get paid, and then when you get out of jail, you get this money and some more help to open a business. And then some of these programs actually have some sort of, you know, coach that goes and helps you for the first 6 months or the first year in terms of your small business, like you open a small restaurant or a small, you know, shop of whatever. And some of these programs are quite successful and they're not that expensive. But again, depends very much. I mean, the other problem is when you have criminals who are addicted to drugs, right? There's a lot of discussion of how to handle addiction and how to cure addiction, because a lot of these people, if they are not taken care in jail, they will do drugs in jail, and when they get out, they will do more drugs, and so they will, you know, be recidivist. So we need some sort of health component. And again, you know, in the United States, it's a difficult country because a lot of people do not want to pay taxes to finance these things, and so it's always sort of a problem to sort of, you know, persuade the public opinion that this is the best program than just being, you know, put them in jail and, you know, and don't care about them. But I agree with you. I mean, it's welfare programs should be considered and should be analyzed. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of game theory of crime. The problem with the game theory is it highlights one issue I mentioned in the beginning, which is sort of a puzzle from a game theory perspective. There's few people like Tom Micheli and Murat Mangan have written about this, which is for the law enforcer agency, it's unclear why you want to punish people, right? If you think in terms of game theory, because when I go and punish people, you already committed a crime. The externality is already done. It's a sunk cost. And if you're going to punish, that's another cost. So why would you do this, right? And so it becomes sort of a problem, particularly if you think of sequential gain, right? I commit a crime, then you move as a law enforcement agency and you decide if you want to punish me or not. When you move, it's a sort of an issue because the crime is sunk at that point. Your decision to move or not move is not going to change the sunk cost. But on the other hand, it's going to generate a cost because we have to do something about punishing criminals. And so from a pure sequential game point of view, in a one-shot game, you are in trouble. So that's why you need multiple shots, or you need some more complex game theory to come up with an explanation for why we want to punish people. Because otherwise, the optimal strategy is not to punish. And if you don't punish, of course, more crimes are committed. And that's sort of a prisoner's dilemma situation. It's worse for everyone. So that's why game theory here, it's really emphasizes some of the inconsistencies of the sequential decision making. How can we reduce pendency in criminal cases in India? That's a very good question. I don't have an answer. If I had the answer, I'll be charging as a consultant some millions to the Indian government. Of course, if you have huge pendency in criminal cases, from a pure economic perspective, you know what's the problem. The problem is you don't have enough supply of criminal courts. That's why you have a backlog, right? I mean, it's like when you have a shortage of a good, you know, it's a problem in the market. Now, what is the solution depends very much. I don't know if the problem is because India over-criminalizes actions, and so you simply have too many crimes. It could be that you don't have enough judges, enough courts. It could be that the police is over-enforcing. And finally, it could be that the system needs some form, not necessarily formal, but some informal plea bargaining to get rid of at least the weaker cases. And that means, you know, 4 different policies. So we would have to go over the situation and try to understand what's not working there. Because usually, basically, either you have a supply side policy, a demand side policy, or sort of an equilibrium policy. Supply side means we need more courts, we need more judges, we need more enforcement. Demand side means we simply are not doing a good job in deterring crimes, maybe because we have the wrong typology, the wrong criminal code, because people are not getting the message, or we need to sort of go into the equilibrium, and that means some form of disposition, plea bargaining, negotiation, we get rid of weaker crimes, and some other mechanisms we can find. So I think that's up to the government to study this carefully and do it. The question about the economics in a sovereign state. So I think there are 2 ways to see this. One is economics is about allocating resources when you have scarce resources available, right? That goes to Renita's question last time. If the government can print money and spend money, should we be that concerned about that? I leave that to the macroeconomists and the people who do public finance. That's sort of a general question. The second question is how much economic reasoning we should have in the judicial system. Now, I think that's something to be decided by the practitioners. I do think a lot of criminal policies in particular are misplaced, are incorrect, because they do not understand the consequences. And if you don't understand the consequences, the policies are wrong. I mentioned the example last time of the social orders in the UK. If you do not understand how the social orders are going to operate, and you think you're addressing the issue of families being dysfunctional, you end up escalating the problem and creating more problems. I think that's where economics is useful in the judicial system, is to basically show how certain rules, certain changes in the law are going to impact, and the impacts might not be what the lawyers expect, because economists think about consequences and long-run effects that many lawyers, or not lawyers, policymakers more, don't really consider or study. Okay.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, someone wanted to ask a question. Please go ahead. Yes, Kanak, go ahead.
Yes, sir. So in India, sir, in 2020 there were Delhi riots where the Hindu sects promptly attacked Muslims and destroyed their properties, and it was pretty much imperative that it was a hate crime having a communal aspect to it. So this situation was based on a discriminatory citizenship law, which was passed by the government of India. And in a diverse country like India, it is full of such cases where the hate crime is evident, especially on the basis of caste, gender, and religion. Sir, although the hate motivation cannot be exactly detectable in such cases, but can we completely negate this? In such cases, and the result of which can be a feeling of alienation and a feeling of threat that the minorities and marginalized communities might feel in our country. So if this hate crime aspect is recognized, then it will also prompt the government to take special measures to eliminate such differences by deterrence and encouraging tolerance.
Yes, let me see if I can find, hang on, give me 1 minute. I'm going to try to put in my chat box a paper I have exactly on what you're saying. So I'm trying to find here, hang on. Okay, so if you go to the chat box, I'm going to try, this is a paper I wrote a few years ago where we try to make sort of the argument you're making. That is that hate crimes may have aspects that are related how people understand the world and even the legitimacy of the legal system. And so that means there is a deterrent component to it, which might or might not be controversial. And as I explained a few moments ago, I think there's some complications with the deterrent component of this, but there is a legitimacy component, as you were saying. And I think given that legitimacy component, you may want to enforce hate crime statutes for the reasons you're saying, that is that the different communities do not feel disproportionately targeted by criminal activities or by victimization. And if that's what's going on there, it is important that these crimes are punished. So in our paper, we have what we call the just world bias, which again is behavioral. So as you can see, it's a sort of a behavioral paper. So the just world bias is a very common bias where people simply think that if a certain group of people, ethnicity, is targeted more often than others, it's because they're bad people, right? And so you sort of build your belief that if people always attack certain kind of people, then it must be that these people are just bad people. Because if you are a good person, you're not being assaulted or beaten so often. So if you're always being a victim of a certain crime, a group of people, then you might say, okay, I believe these people are just, there's something wrong with them. They're just bad people, and this is why it's happening. This is not racism. This is not about whatever. It's about you are just bad guys, and that's why you get beaten more often. So what we try to argue is that if you have that certain bias in most of the population, you need hate crime statutes to sort of compensate for that. Otherwise, you're reinforcing a bias, which is going to affect enforcement. Because at some point, what's going to happen is, if we all believe that these people, these victims, are bad people anyway, then we should also not spend money with law enforcement against the perpetrators. Because the perpetrators, yeah, they might not be doing something nice, but the victims are bad people anyway. So this is going to create a very inefficient allocation of resources. So the argument we have in the paper is, in order to enhance legitimacy, in order to make sure that you do not end up blaming the victims, you need to have hate crime statutes that really punish this sort of hate crimes, with all the caveats I had said before, that might be difficult to detect them, it might make litigation more cumbersome, it might affect the behavior of law enforcement agents, but still there is an aspect to be considered there. So I hope I answered your question. Of course, I don't know the details in India, but I think it's generally the same problem.
Yes, sir, definitely.
Okay, I think we're running out of time. I think you guys want to have dinner, and I want to go and have my lunch soon. So I think I'm going to conclude just saying we covered criminal law and economics. I hope it has persuaded you that there's some merits to this literature, that also many problems and many challenges. And I want to spend the next 2 days on constitutional law and economics, which is going to be somehow different from criminal law and economics. Of course, if anyone has questions, you feel free to email me. I think everyone has my email, but I'm going to put on the chat box. I'm happy to respond to more specific questions or specific points you may have or if you need any recommendations for specific papers. Okay, otherwise, thank you so much. All of you have a nice dinner, a nice evening, and I'll see you tomorrow at the same time.
So one
Thank you,
question.
sir.
One question. Holding
Right.
everybody back from their meals, but one question. So you made a mention of, crime being prevalent both in capitalism and socialism. Would it be correct to say that the typology of the crime changes from being objective, kind of invisible and nuanced in capitalism versus maybe subjective individual level crimes in socialism, but the aggregate impact of these objective invisible crimes happening from a systemic structure of invisible crime, those costs would be way higher? Would that be?
Well, I mean, I think part of the problem is in the pure Marxist theory, you have no private property. And so the idea would be there is no crime because there's no private property. And the reason why we have crimes in capitalism is private property. It's the fact that some people have more than others. There is inequality that drives crime. So that's sort of the simplistic Marxist view of the problem. So in socialist countries where you have no private property, obviously there wouldn't be any crime because everything is public, it's owned by the state. So there is no incentive to commit crimes. Unfortunately, as we know, that's incorrect because even if there is very little private property, as economists we know, food is a private good because the food you consume, your neighbor cannot consume your food. So immediately, something as simple as food and drinks are private. As soon as they're private, of course, there's going to be inequality because not everyone has the same food and not everyone has the same access to drinks. So from then on, you can see there's going to be crime, even in a socialist society. Now, and I mean here essentially property crime. Of course, I'm not meaning sexual violence and murder, because these crimes will exist everywhere and they don't depend on the political typology of the regime. So I think part of the problem is going to be the fact that even if you had full, I mean, you have a problem. Which the only way to eliminate property crime would be to have full equality at the marginal utility of everyone, which is just impossible. Because even if we have all the same food, the same quantity of food, and the same quantity of drinks, the fact is I don't eat a lot. Some of you, because you're young and growing up, you eat a lot. So even if I have one bread and you have one bread, there's still inequality, because maybe I only need half a bread and you guys need 2 breads. So it's going to be hugely impossible to have a society where we have such equality at the marginal level that all property crime is eliminated. I'm sorry if I sound very pessimistic about humankind, but I don't see how we can actually do that. And so I think it's naive.
So the only point was that the marginal cost with regard to both these, systems would be lower as far, it will be there, but it will be way lower.
Yes. Yes.
In a socialist setup compared to for the very reason that the marginal differences between the ownership of properties.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that is on property crime. On violent crime, I don't believe that the socialist man is less violent than the capitalist man. I mean, I don't think that's, I don't think it goes to that biological typology. So I think, a different issue is, as someone asked in the box, if you have a society run by women being very different from a society run by men. But that's not socialism and capitalism. That's a different discussion. Yes, there I can see being some differences. But in terms of capitalism and socialism, I don't think it impacts violent crime.
Thank you.
Okay. In any case, we can come back to this tomorrow, because we're talking about constitutional law and economics. So we'll be back to capitalism and socialism, constitutions and things like that.
Right,
okay,
Professor?
Guys.
Yes.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you and good night to the participants.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
So we can close today's session.
Yeah, with the last reminder for the abstracts and reflect notes, 10th is the last day.
10th is the last day. Let's keep that in mind. Thank you so much for being with us till 8:40. Good night and have a nice dinner. See you again tomorrow. Good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good night, ma'am.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks.